Deutsche Welle Global Media Forum, the international congress that provides a platform for more than 2,000 media representatives and experts from the fields of politics, culture, business, development, and science.
Welcome to Bonn, the UN city of Germany.
These delegates design interdisciplinary approaches to meeting the challenges of global problems and explore how the media can play a central role in investigating and communicating solutions.
Der eigentliche Rohstoff.
The real natural resource of our time is no longer under our feet, but between our ears. The three-day conference program contains more than 50 panel discussions, workshops, interactive presentations, and exhibitions, as well as attractive leisure events in and around the World Conference Center in Bonn, Germany.
It is great for me to be back in Bonn.
So that means half of the human beings in this world spend their lives on less than $10 a week.
I read the newspaper because every day I want to find out how they want to trick me this day.
You feel the mission.
Launch a one-year campaign. You get very, very useful information.
Highlight what is actually happening in this world.
Between journalism, advocacy and diplomacy.
To actually push the issue rather than try and push themselves.
The challenge is the question of democracy and elections. Keep that alive and build a more stable and more transparent and accountable democracy.
So next time you must join us.
Thank you.
Each year, the conference has focused on a different issue related to media and development. In 2008, the conference theme was Media in Peace Building and Conflict Prevention. In 2009, Conflict Prevention in the Multimedia Age. The topic in 2010, The Heat is On, Climate Change and the Media. 2011, Human Rights in a Globalized World, Challenges for the Media. And in 2012, Culture, Education, Media, Shaping a Sustainable World. For the participants from more than 100 nations, the forum offers excellent opportunities for conversation and exchange. As a result, an international network has developed and is still growing. The future of growth, economic values, and the media will be the topic of the upcoming conference in 2013. How can the media explore and communicate systematic approaches toward a sustainable global economy? Engage in our international network. Be part of the solution to global issues and become a member of the Deutsche Welle Global Media Forum family.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to day 2 of the Deutsche Welle Global Media Forum 2013. The topic you've just seen, ladies and gentlemen, and I think we have the future with us. So permit me, dear participants, we have this morning young people from the city of Brühl in the vicinity of Bonn who have gotten up at 6 o'clock in the morning to especially be with us here today to follow the morning, which is going to be absolutely fascinating because, of course, we're going to have the appearance of our Foreign Minister, Guido Westerwelle, later on. But first of all, we're going to have a wonderful panel to kick us off. As you well know, ladies and gentlemen, we're right at the moment in a process. The world community is trying to suss out how are we going to set the goals for the future. We've had the Millennium Development Goals. We've had the focus on poverty eradication. Didn't quite work, but it was the right direction. And then suddenly the question was, what about sustainability? How can we have sustainable growth? Do we need green growth? And who is going to decide about that? So on the UN level, we're going to have a merger between the two sets of goals, poverty eradication and sustainability. That's the so-called post-2015 process. But who's going to carry it out? Well, all of us, the press, the media is going to comment and also to criticize what's happening. But who are the people, who are the organizations actually carrying it out? The corporates, the nations, or maybe all of us, i.e. the global community? And that is the question that Monica Jones and her fabulous panel will answer, or will try to find answers to, in the next hour. So please give Monica and her panel a hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. You set the bar pretty high. We're going to answer all these questions right now. I'm just waiting for my guests to take a seat. Good morning, everybody, from my side as well. Good to see you all here. I've been warned beforehand that the plenary room will be very empty because of the boat trip last night, which I believe was a big success. So it's even better to see you all here, bright and early and ready also to join us in this discussion round. The title of our plenary, I find, is pretty optimistic. It's called Global Governance, Blueprint for a Sustainable World Economy. Rather utopic, actually. And when we think about what Connie just said, there's so many players involved. We all know that the global population keeps growing, while the world as such is actually getting smaller. Globalization certainly has provided us with many opportunities, but we're also faced with lots of challenges, which many believe can only be tackled on a global scale. But how is this going to work? And this is what we're here to discuss. So let me first please introduce to you who these gentlemen are. On the very far side to your left, depending on where you sit, is Mr. Art de Gois. He's the chairman and CEO of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, or foundation, a foundation that's supporting education, which is interesting for you, I should think, economy, welfare, health, and intercultural relations. Mr. de Gois, good to have you here with us. Whenever you feel you want to applaud, you're welcome to do so. Next to him is Mr. Wally Musa. He's the former Environment Minister of South Africa. He's also Deputy Executive Chairman of Lyrico Investments in Johannesburg. Good to have you with us. Then here, this gentleman is Dr. Hans-Joachim Preuss. He's Managing Director of the German agency, as I learned it is called, for International Cooperation, the GIZ. Good morning to you. And the gentleman to my right is Professor Mohan Munasinghe. He's, that's a very long list now, Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. He's also, of course, the chairman of the Munasinghe Institute for Development in Sri Lanka, and he also shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 as vice chair of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A very good morning to you. Now, of course, we have actually less than an hour because we started slightly late, and I was told we have to finish a bit earlier before Mr. Westerwelle, the minister, is joining us. So let me quickly tell you that before we start the opening round, where each of the gentlemen is allowed to give his key points to us, you can also join us in the discussion. You've got microphones in front of you. I need a clear hand sign so that I can give you the floor for your question. Please make sure that your question or intervention is very, very short and precise so we can make the most of it. And there's also a lady sitting over there, Jana, in a red dress. She will take care of all the tweets that we get, because you can also join us on Twitter. If you want to stay anonymous, you can just send us a tweet and she will pass it on to us. Okay. Having said all this, let's get started. Global governance. Blueprint for a sustainable world economy. Perhaps we should first define what we mean by global governance. Who or what is setting the standards? Mr. de Gois.
Well, I take my mic.
That would help.
And thank you all for applauding before I have said anything. That was really great experience. But I try to live up to your expectations. In this global governance, we see clearly the three big challenges, which is on the one, number one, the environment. We live and we consume on one Earth as if we would have 1.5 Earth, and that will be, in a few years, will be 2.0. So we are consuming and producing double and leaving trash, etc. The second is demographic. in the future we are all born in developing countries. Well, imagine that you are reborn, but well, we are all born in developing countries, we live longer, and we are moving to cities, so we have more migration as well. That puts a lot of weight also on the economic challenges. And then the third is the inequality, because on the one hand we have a smaller part of the population in mere poverty, but we have growing inequalities in the OECD countries, but also in the developing countries. So a new set of goals has to be set. After the MDGs, we need the Sustainable Development Goals. We need a broader set of goals also to include the economy. Let me point out reliable finance, fair trade, socio-economic opportunities, the environment protection mechanisms, and last but not least, a legitimate global governance. And that was exactly, I think, the question you pointed out. So what is this global governance? What does it look like? Is there a new authority governing us all? I don't think so. Is it the UN? Yes, the UN can facilitate, but can do not so much more than setting a framework. And after that, there has to be a coordination between countries who are really willing to make a difference. And these country governments have to be pushed by society. I think I make a strong pledge here this morning for active civil society, because it is there where the pressure comes, and there where country governments would act. And you see it, some countries like maybe Denmark, or maybe partly also Germany, but partly also other countries who push for these goals are pushed by their societies. So let's see that there is a role also for not only for foundations, but also for media and for groups, for students. What's happening now in the world, it's pushed by the people. We see it all over the world. We see it in Turkey, we see it in Brazil, we see it everywhere. And we, as a Bertelsmann Stiftung, we can contribute by releasing studies about the positive effects of free trade. And then, you know, there can be more growth. There can be more inclusive growth. But the setting of these goals, and which has to be in the UN. And then the active governments have to be pushed by the people. That is extremely important. Thank you.
There's 2 points there. I mean, first of all, do we all agree that these goals have to be set by the UN? Is that a given? And secondly, the empowerment of the people. You mentioned Turkey just now. This morning I heard on the news that there is, on a smaller scale, there are some demonstrations in Brazil, in Brasilia, in Rio. People are outraged over the pricing of public transport. So empowerment of the people without coordination. Are we looking there at a kind of global governance, empowerment of the people, or is this leading towards anarchy?
Well, history proves that big changes always came unexpected. And so therefore it is important that on the one hand you have this process of building a legitimate framework and changing the global governance in the sense that the developing countries get a bigger role. We in the Western world have to make place in global governance systems, in IMF, in UN and in other systems. We have to make place for these developing countries, and that's all good. But then the push for change can only come from informed, well-educated people who take the lead in calls for change. And then, of course, it comes together with coincidences, which you cannot predict. But if people are well informed and are aware of the chances that there lie, I think there is this role for civil society, yes.
Okay, so the push has to come from the people. How would that work now with a specific example? You're from South Africa. South Africa, I think, has 70% of the world's total population of rhinoceros, which is, they're beautiful animals, but they're now extremely under threat. There's a lot of poaching going on. mostly due to demand from Vietnam, China, several other countries as well. What kind of push could the people of South Africa, what kind of power could they have in order to prevent it? What's going on there?
Thank you, Monica, and good morning to the audience. You've picked on an interesting example that indicates the need for global governance. And for me, global governance is really about promoting the rule of law. And the rule of law anywhere in the world, in all jurisdictions, is there primarily to protect the weak against the powerful. In any situation, in any country, the powerful generally don't like government. The weak members of society like government because government is there to protect them from the powerful, so to say. It's a very simplistic way of putting it, but that's what it is. And on a global scale, that is the same situation. Unfortunately, we do have a situation in the world today where the powerful are not really interested in global governance because they don't need it. It's the weak who need global governance. So if you take the question of rhinos or any species that is endangered on this planet, by and large it is the global aim is to protect species through a global governance instrument called the Convention for Biological Diversity. But you have the United States of America is not signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Yet if you take nature does not know political boundaries. Nature is, just ecosystems traverse political boundaries, and species do the same thing. Currently, we have a situation in southern Africa where there's large-scale poaching of rhinos, both the black rhinos and the white rhinos, and many experts are of the view that rhinos will become extinct in our generation if it continues at the pace at which it is continuing. And the poaching that takes place is organized by criminal syndicates that operate on a global level, not on a South African level, on a global level. So the only way to combat this is if you have adequate global governance. And right now you don't have that. You don't have a situation where species are being protected adequately on a global scale. It's the same thing about marine species. Most of the surface area of the planet Earth is made up of the oceans. 64% of the oceans are beyond national jurisdictions, in other words, beyond the political boundaries of countries, what is referred to as the high seas. And by and large, there is more or less no law and order applicable on the high seas, and the powerful can do as they wish. And you have that kind of current situation. So I think from an environmental and a sustainable development point of view, global governance is essential. And that's not about setting up a world government, because that won't happen. It's about establishing the management of global processes in the absence of world government. That's what global governance is. And it's about establishing duties, obligations, and privileges for individuals and countries and groups of people, and also establishing platforms to mediate differences between people.
Okay, so if we do not have a global government that would provide global governance, what kind of surveillance is there then? Because if you have all these different players, these different stakeholders on all these different levels, from the very powerful to the people on the street, NGOs, and the world is still a big place, even though I said it's getting smaller and smaller. How do you watch what's happening? How can you be a watchdog and make sure that governance is actually adhered to the way it was meant to be?
Well, I think the only way in which to do that is to make the price of not adhering to the rule of law for governments too high. It should be too high. And the only way to do that, and we're here really to talk about what role the media can play. If the media informs members of the public, who are ultimately the voters, adequately, that those voters will not look kindly on a government that is acting in a manner which promotes the large-scale poaching of rhinos, for example, you know. And so I think that's the important thing. It's not going to be simply through a system of courts and police, global courts and global police forces. Of course, you do have that, but it's not simply going to be through that. It will largely, in my view, happen through citizen action and through the voices of citizens. And this is where the media is so important to provide accurate information to the public, which I think doesn't always happen, but that's what would make a big difference.
When you just say that, because we do obviously have the room full of media colleagues, you say it's not always accurate. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's not always accurate. The reason for that is that just from the little I know, most media institutions are under tremendous pressure. They're under budget pressure, they're understaffed, and they need to be producing copy all of the time, instantly. They need to be producing new stories all of the time. So the result of which is that you have large-scale cut and paste operations that journalists conduct. And so they take the new stories from where it's manufactured very quickly and very fast. So if you take my own country, the media institutions do not really have the ability to manufacture stories as quickly as they are manufactured in London or in the United States, or perhaps here in Europe. And so everybody else around the world cuts and pastes stories that are manufactured by CNN or whoever else. And that becomes almost a kind of a dominant point of view, not because people want to do it, but it's just the way in which processes work. And the result of which is that you don't get accurate reporting at the end of the day. You don't get sufficient reporting about the fact. I mean, how many people, in fact, know that one of the only countries that refuses to have a global system of governing biodiversity in this world is the United States? That it refuses to sign the Convention for Biological Diversity. How many people know that? And you don't know that is because most of the stories are cut and paste from US sources. They don't really talk about that these people really don't, you know, the rest of us say, let us consider rhinos as property of the world community. These are global citizens, and we as the world should together want to protect them. Everybody else says yes, except for the United States. Now, I mean, you wouldn't know that if that wasn't the dominant manufacturer of media stories. It's just one example that I'm giving. So I think that we all have a responsibility really to do much more work to communicate accurately to the public.
Okay.
Just a brief addition to that. I think indeed the role of the media is key, but these media on their turn have to rely on accurate research and watchdog functions. So here, an organization like OECD, there's a workshop this afternoon about that, is a great watchdog, for example, in tax evasion, which is extremely important. As Bertelsmann Foundation, we have this Bertelsmann Transformation Index where we watch the rule of law in developing countries. Media can transmit that, but these sources are also available on the internet. So a lot of information is available. Let us use the opportunities of this new internet media information era that we are entering. And from there also, we can have pressure from people, as we both said. And then you see already that this is working for big brands like Shell or Puma, etc., under pressure, and then they change. In the end, no big company wants to be shamed. So naming and shaming is a part of the game, and we should do the same to governments. And then these governments could take another stand in international debates, and from that, global governance can grow.
Naming and shaming, I mean, there were protests in Germany now with Obama arriving, because you just mentioned also the United States. But that came from the people, mostly. whether it will impress the government enough to rethink policies is another question. I would like to bring in Hans-Joachim Preuss at this point. I mean, you've worked for both NGOs as well as governmental institutions right now for the German Agency for International Cooperation, and we've heard already about all the different levels and the different players, the different stakeholders that should create a kind of global governance. Do they actually see eye to eye? You've seen two sides at least, and you're a citizen as well, so there's a third perspective of yours. Can they actually see eye to eye? Because there are different interests on all sides.
Yeah, still I think there are different interests on two sides, and if you bring in the media, the academia and politics, for instance, you will see other interests as well. And we did not mention the business up to now. I think they play a very important role when talking about economic sustainability in the world. So when we are talking about global governance, we are talking about governance without government. And I think this is a specific case. And in my view, when talking about global governance, it's not about global governance per se. We have to talk about good global governance or effective global governance. For me, effective global governance can be demonstrated in three dimensions. First, I think it's the authority that global governments must have. What is authority? It's the ability to enforce norms, rules, and regulations at an international level. So that's not the case up to now. The second dimension for me is the capacity. So to what extent is the global governance able to respond to the needs, to the requirements of the respective constituency? And the third dimension for me is the question of legitimacy. So how can I convince the governed that they convey power to the superior levels? And in my view, the system of global governance consisting of institutions like the United Nations and so, or the international conferences, conventions, etc., has not yet reached high levels in these different dimensions. So, and the second point I'd like to make is that we, in the past, too much concentrated or focused on governments and not on the other actors on the international scene. For instance, non-governmental organizations, the private business, the academia, the media, and so on. So we have to bring these different stakeholders together in order, because they can influence, they can accelerate, and they can jeopardize the process of global sustainable development. So, and I think to facilitate this exchange, this cooperation, this networking is very important. In the past, when the non-governmental organizations and business met, for instance, the usual outcome was either confrontation or donation. So I think these are the two outcomes. Now we come to other levels. I think this is already understood at the international level, perhaps not yet at the level of the Western countries who still consider NGOs as the perhaps watchdogs. They can influence the public opinion, they can influence the media, but they do not have the professionalism to really take part in global decision making. This view has changed, and I think this is a very good development.
Professor Monasenge, you said just before we walked down here that it would be interesting to find out if global governance is actually something that is desirable. Because we talk here about like it's a given, but there might be a different thought on that, and I'd be interested to hear it from you.
Okay, yeah, I mean, basically, the point I want to make is not that we need some form of governance, but basically define governance in a way, first start by saying what we do not want. For example, global governance to me is not setting up a super international agency with police powers to enforce on people a new set of rules. I mean, that's not. But we do need it, and this is the answer to your question, because we face problems that are complex. They are interrelated, as the earlier speakers have said, and we need desperately integrated solutions, because if we try to address them one at a time, we're not going to solve them. I mean, the classic example is that I've worked on poverty alleviation for 40 years or more. In the middle part of the 20th century, people thought that growth was the answer to the world's problems. But really focusing too much on the economic growth dimension actually destroyed major parts of the environment. And then you have the social aspect as well, because many people were disempowered. So you need to keep the economic, social, and environmental in balance, and so the solutions have to be comprehensive as well. So this requires an approach that is different from what we are doing now. To say that it is global governance which is going to be this different approach, I think is too simplistic. It's not a magic bullet, right? But let us see how we need to look at the problems a little differently. I think we should not be looking at poverty or environment or any of these piecemeal, but look at the drivers. The drivers of these problems are essentially consumption, production and technology, governance is one of them, or bad governance, and of course the population. And if we look at that lower level of drivers and address those, then I think we can begin to solve all the problems in an integrated way. So for example, we can solve not only the poverty issue, but climate, as well as other issues at the same time. This is what I mean by integrated solution. As a scientist, I can tell you we have the models and methods to do it. Unfortunately, the decision makers are not particularly interested. And now we come to my last point about governance, that I feel that leaders and top-down methods are less and less capable of providing the kinds of solutions we need. I mean, go to any major conference, hardly any decisions are made. Leaders come and have photo ops and PR and go back and they said, we did this and that. But nothing actually happens. I was, for example, at Rio +20 plus innumerable climate summits. What we need, as my colleagues have said, is much more pressure from the bottom up. Certainly civil society, but I would include here also responsible business, not working against government, because governments are there, elected or otherwise. We have to push them, as one of the speakers said, to do the right thing. And it is that empowerment from the bottom up which should be actually be much more powerful force and should be encouraged. And my very last point, Monica, is that the media has a fantastic role to play here. I mean, if you report what you believe is the truth and not be influenced overly by the establishment and the powers that be to distort what is going on, then you are empowering people and using the power of the modern media and social media and the internet in a way that will bring about better governance.
It almost sounded to me like we could turn the title of this plenary then upside down when I was listening to you, when we take responsible businesses, civic society, NGOs, the media, and create a blueprint for global governance by their behavior, so turning it around. But I'll just keep an eye if I have missed any contribution? Any hand sign? I can't see anything at the moment. We have, well, let's say maybe 10 to 12 more minutes, so if you would like to join, then now would be a good time to think about what you would like to ask or say. Businesses, we had the G8 meeting today, obviously trying to hammer out some kind of new rules to prevent further tax dodgers, which of course is interesting when you think about most of these big tax schemes. They did not grow on trees. They were actually introduced by governments in the first place, and now they sit together and try to find a way around it and avoid it because it costs so much money. But on a smaller scale, I mean, you're doing the German Agency for International Cooperation is also working with UN Global Compact, where you go to companies and ask them to embrace universal principles to do business. Also, for example, in Bangladesh, and there the media, for example, played a huge role in covering especially everything that went wrong there. So how would you say this kind of approach is working? Can you tell us anything maybe encouraging since those horrific pictures we've seen in recent months?
Perhaps the difference is it was not GIZ or the German government who talked to the business firms, but it was the business firms themselves who felt left alone with the challenges, because the media reported about misbehavior in the respective locations where they worked, the exploitation of workers, non-respect of social norms, ecological norms, and so on. So I think the call of the former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan for this global compact was answered by a number of very, very important business firms. So I think they come together, and what GIZ is doing, we are hosting the secretariat of the German Global Compact platform, and this allows, and by moderating, by facilitating, by networking, we allow them to adhere to internationally accepted practices as well. For instance, what we are doing, we are supporting bring together national governments with national firms, as was the case in Bangladesh after the crash of the building. So there was an initiative of the textile industry in Bangladesh to adhere to standards of building, to establish new standards for building and for fire control and so on. And so we were ready to respond to these requirements, and we are happy that we can do so. So I think we could bring together government, civil society, workers' organizations, and business at the same time. And I think this is very important. And with regard to the media, I think it's important that the media do not only report about the bad cases and the catastrophes, but as well about best practices when businesses perhaps reflect how can they do better in the future. I think the two sides must be regarded by the media and must be conveyed to the public as well. This is very important.
I think that's a very important point, because you can get very easily very jaded watching the news when there's never any good story being told, especially when there is one. I believe we have some tweets coming in. Jana, tell us.
Yes, we do. They're busy discussing the panel, and they agree with the panelists that media is very important in global governance, but also say, news are produced so fast that the accuracy really suffers. So that was one point. And I have a question to Mr. Munasinghe. If he's about climate change, what future does he see for a Doha agreement? Would be one. And another one wonders, one user, if governments would ever go to the negotiating table for an issue like international poaching. So,
which obviously would be a question for you, but let's start with you, Professor.
Yes, climate change. Basically, I would say that climate change should not be addressed in isolation. My main point is that if we bend the curve of development, we can address climate change at the same time we are addressing issues like poverty and so on. The mistake we have been making is trying to isolate climate change. It is so far removed from the ordinary person's ken that understanding that it is difficult to mobilize support. I mean, if you look at what happened in recent times, the financial economic crisis, which hurt everybody's pocketbook, very quickly governments found $6 trillion, $6,000 billion to solve that problem. For poverty, 2 billion poor people, we are giving about 100 billion a year, 1/60th. And for climate change, we are giving a few billion dollars. So you can see the priorities. Now, for climate, I think we are facing a very severe situation. We have ignored the Climate Convention of 1992, which I helped to frame, which was a very powerful document. We have overlooked the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which was a weak agreement. Even that has not been met. The main emitters are continuing to emit without any abatement. So the poor of the world will suffer most because of climate change. And this is a very inequitable situation because they had the least to do with the problem. So the tweet is absolutely right. I think we need to do something about climate change. But in order to give it the right kind of attention, we should point out that by making the world more sustainable, by bending the curve of development, we can solve not only climate change, but all the other problems at the same time.
Because when you mentioned right at the beginning, the financial crisis hurt our pockets, so we heard all about it. There's still discussions going on about it. So when it hurts our pockets, then it's important, which brings me to the second tweet about, I mean, would governments ever get together to discuss something like poaching, or is profit always before conscience?
Well, you know, I think to be fair to governments, there is something called the CITES, the Convention for the International Trade in Endangered Species, which does regulate this to quite some extent. The only problem that we have is that it's not effective. It's not effective. So I think governments would, the answer to that, yes, I think governments would probably get together at various fora to discuss this matter, but whether it's going to be effective is really the question. And right now, there isn't sufficient commitment to making work that which governments have already committed themselves to.
I mean, climate is a point, obviously, that we all feel, and we talk about global values, and there is, before I am going on, there is a gentleman who would like to ask a question. Not yet. Keep trying.
Okay. My question is to ask you to please reflect on some of the remarks made yesterday evening by Professor Chomsky. If you can at least accept the concept that the elites, the 1% of this world, manipulate, trick, lie, everything that you're discussing always comes into the conflict between the elites and the 99%. Can you begin to talk about policies that would directly address this need for profits? Why can't we talk about nationalization of resources? Why can't we directly confront business? Why do we have to accept that this 1% has the right to their profits? Every one of you seems to keep talking about, yes, business, business, business. I would say, let's get rid of them. What right do they have to demand that their profits come in before? You know, the whole concept of green economy, to me, is a contradiction. How can you possibly say green economy, but no, only if it makes money? I think that we as a conscious people have to say, no, we have to move against that concept of profits.
Okay, thank you very much for this very angry contribution, but when we look around in the world, in various pockets of the world, and these pockets are growing, there seem to be a lot of angry people around. So is time running out? We're sitting here talking about global governance and solving and making the world a better place, and we don't actually have the time to discuss any longer.
Well, just the one point, I think Hans pointed out to some of these things that he spoke about. What we must accept is that there's a tremendous amount of suspicion on the part of citizens about businesses and corporates, and often for good reason. So I think we should take that as accepted. The one thing that I think can be done, and I would just give an example from South Africa. In South Africa, all companies are required annually in their annual report, not only to report on financial performance, but to report on their impact on society and the environment also at the same time. And so it's called the integrated report. And part of what I think we should be encouraging is more interest on the part of shareholders to ensure that companies do this and to question them. That's just one tiny little measure going towards moving away from something we had 20 or 30 years ago, a kind of a global philosophy that corporates should be left to do as they wish, that it's not acceptable anymore, and there needs to be greater levels of governance and oversight even about corporates.
It just seems it's always more difficult to put the lid back on once it's been taken off in that case. Professor?
I want to address the issue of how to bring about change, because clearly we have a slippery slope which we are going down, and either we reverse direction and climb back up, or we fall off the cliff. Either way, change will happen. Now, if we fall off the cliff, hundreds of millions could die, and the world will change very substantially. So we should talk now about the interests of the elite and the responsibility of the elites. Because before, in a smaller world, this kind of rapacious behavior could be managed in the sense there were enough resources to pillage. But now, the situation is that with the Anthropocene era, where human beings are affecting the whole globe, that if that kind of rapacious behavior goes on, the entire global system will collapse. So it's a little bit like the Titanic. The first-class passengers are on the top deck, and they're having caviar and listening to the orchestra. And of course, when the boat sinks, it's the people in the bottom who will... it's like the Titanic, that the people on the top deck are having caviar and enjoying themselves, but as the boat sinks, although the sailors in the bottom will die first, eventually the water will also reach the rich. So I think there is the interests of the rich. They have to understand that they have a stake in the system and must bring about change, because they are better educated, more influential, and so on than anybody. We can't really get rid of the elites, because elites have governed the world all the time, and they will always remain. But basically what we are saying is we have to bring about this value change, and therefore we have to, in a sense, co-opt parts of the establishment. And this is why we need some businesses, at least the responsible businesses, on our side. We can't fight everybody at the same time. So I'm saying we must bring about change and changes in values, but we must do it in a way that is more cooperative and inclusive, not only including the poor, but including the rich as well. Thank you.
This microphone does work brilliant. Looking at the clock, I know that we are expecting a very important guest in just a few minutes, and it would not be fair probably to start with a new question, because the topic is complex enough as it is. I would like to thank you, my panel, for being here today, and I hope we managed to give you a bit of food for thought. As I said, very complex, and certainly we couldn't solve it. But thank you very much for joining us this morning, and please a warm round of applause for the panel. Thank you very much for being here.